Coming up on Chopper's Election Podcast.
I think the Brexit Party will win any MPs. I don't think
That's
they'll win
amazing.
any MPs, but I think he could go down in history as the most influential politician of the modern era.
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Election Podcast. That's right. For the next 5 weeks, we're rebranding to bring you comprehensive coverage before Britons head to the polls on December the 12th. We'll be inviting the biggest names in politics to the Red Lion pub and leaving Westminster altogether to talk to people at the heart of the campaigns. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. And this week, the starting gun was fired on possibly the most important general election of our lifetimes. Well, since the last one anyway. So today, at the start of this crucial period, I'll be talking to Energy Minister Kwasi Kwarteng, Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics at Kent University, and an academic who's more clued up on the polls than anyone else I can think of. Plus, I'll be sitting down with Andrew Murray, Chief of Staff at Unite the Union and a key advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. But first up, and in the wake of Boris Johnson's campaign launch on Wednesday night, I'm pleased to be joined by Sir Graham Brady, the Tory candidate for Altrincham and Sale West, who until Parliament was dissolved was acting chairman of the 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs. Sir Graham Brady, welcome to Chopper's Election Podcast.
It's good to be here.
How's it going, the election for the Tory party?
Well, I think you could say we haven't had the smoothest start to the campaign. I guess you'd also say nor of the others. So maybe this is going to be a slightly messy campaign, just like it's been a messy 2 years.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because a difficult start with the Alan Cairns resignation, Jacob Rees-Mogg on Grenfell, and now suddenly we're talking about Tom Watson quitting politics. I mean, it's...
Yes, and Ian Austin's very serious statements urging Labour supporters to vote Conservative, and obviously raising this awful issue of anti-Semitism, which is also now, I see the front page of the Jewish Chronicle, making it clear that nearly half of British Jews are so frightened of what would happen with the Corbyn government that they're contemplating emigrating if it were to happen.
I think it's going to be one of those topsy-turvy campaigns. We're 6 weeks out, and I think it's quite a mistake to judge it on days 1, 2 and 3, I'm almost certain. But the issue of Jeremy Corbyn's character will be something which the Tory party will be pushing quite hard, I imagine.
I think it's inevitable, and I think it's unfortunate because I would rather see an entirely positive campaign. But when you have a Labour leader that so many members of the Labour Party, so many Labour members of Parliament over the last few years have regarded as unfit to hold office, I think it is very difficult, in fact impossible, to avoid that issue. It is one of the crucial points in the campaign. But in my view, I think, of course we're going to have a vigorous campaign, probably an unpleasant and nasty campaign, lots of negative stuff on both sides, potentially. But actually, everybody already knows what all of the significant issues are for the next election. Everybody knows this is really a choice between either straightening out Parliament and allowing the country to move forward and do different things, or sending it back to a terrible kind of stagnation where we just have endless delay.
I mean, Brexit is in the in tray of the new Prime Minister on December the 13th in number 10 Downing Street, because they've got to work out how on earth we get out of the EU if we do by the end of January with Boris Johnson's deal, or a whole new deal and a referendum if Labour get in, or canning the whole thing if Joe Swinton becomes Prime Minister. But do you think there's any chance that Brexit may trickle down the list of priorities as the election goes on, and that might be a problem for the Tory party?
Well, I hope it will. No, I really hope it will. I don't think that's a problem for the Conservative Party. My constituency was a Remain voting constituency.
You're a Leaver yourself?
I'm a Leaver. The last election in 2017, I nonetheless got the biggest vote that I'd ever had. But most of the conversations I have with constituents who voted to Remain are prefaced with, I voted to Remain, but I accept the result. And I think most people recognise, even if they think they made the right decision previously, they recognise that in a democracy you respect that result and you accommodate it and you move on and try to make sure you achieve our exit from the EU in the right way, which is a free trading, open, globally engaged future, also very closely cooperating with our European friends.
It's been quite a big 2 or 3 years for yourself because you're chairman or have been chairman of the 1922 committee of Tory MPs. How do you find that period? I mean, your archive will be quite interesting for historians, I imagine.
Potentially, yes. And
all the letters you have and the rest.
And I haven't written the memoir yet, but thank you for the advanced publicity for it. And one day,
do you think the party hung on to Theresa May for too long? Do you think, in retrospect, as leader?
I mean, it was obvious that we reached a point where it wasn't working. The difficulty that I had in managing a process, which was set out in our own rules, was that it was a slightly opaque process. Nobody knew, in writing letters calling for a confidence vote, nobody knew whether that was going to trigger the confidence vote at that point or not. And whether those rules should be revisited is an interesting
What do you
question
think to that
for
question
the future.
If you get re-elected?
I just think it's very, very difficult to come up with a different system. You need to have something which is responsive to the actual wishes of the colleagues in Parliament, and that's something that, however you do it, you're going to end up with some messy situations in some circumstances.
The party has tried to deliver a kind of compromise on Brexit, and that proved to be impossible. But the fact the party tried to do it, I think, might give it some credit. And the compromise, I mean Theresa May's deal, which I think was a compromise on Brexit rather than actually leaving.
Yes, but I think Theresa May's deal was a compromise, but as was clear from the outset, and I went to see her as soon as the shape of the deal emerged last autumn and told her that I didn't think there was any way it could achieve a majority in the House of Commons. And the fundamental reason was the so-called Irish backstop, which has had so much airtime ever since. So, I think the true compromise, really, the viable compromise, is the deal that Boris Johnson secured. It follows the amendment that passed in my name back at the end of January.
The Brady Amendment,
the so-called Brady Amendment, which was to approve the withdrawal agreement but without the backstop. And the deal that Boris Johnson has secured does reflect that. It is the removal of that backstop, and of course, therefore, it secured a majority vote in the House of Commons.
What's your message to Tory MPs who are flirting with Nigel Farage? Now, he's made it clear he's open to talking to candidates and may even not stand the Brexit Party candidate against them at the election. I think the price is going to be a vote against Boris's deal if you get elected.
Look, I think it's crazy not to support this deal. We have got a good compromise settlement. It's something that will allow the United Kingdom to leave the European Union in an orderly, calm way. It'll settle the concerns of business. I think as soon as we get it through, I think it'll unlock enormous amounts of investment. And I think that we are set fair economically, even though the world is in a very difficult economic situation at the moment once we do that. So I hope all of my colleagues, when elected to Parliament on the 12th of December, will fully support this deal.
They've got to.
They've got to.
It'll be in the manifesto as well, won't it? So.
It'll be in the manifesto, but crucially, it's clearly the right way of resolving this. And all of the other options in this election would ensure that we continue to go on about Brexit perpetually.
I think that won't stop, Graham. I'm sorry to disabuse you of that.
Well, I think that once we have actually left the European Union, the whole nature of the debate shifts to what kind of future relationship we should have. That's a more positive discussion and a more sensible way of spending our time.
I've got to ask you about John Bercow. He's revealed this, finally revealed, come clean, although we're pretty new it anyway, because he said he voted to remain to Reading University a couple of years ago. I revealed it in the Telegraph, but he's now said that it's the biggest mistake since the Second World War. I mean, what's your take on John Bercow? You can speak freely now as left Parliament.
I've known John Bercow for a very long time. He's a little bit older than I am, but we were both involved in student politics together. We entered the House of Commons together in 1997. We used to sit next to each other in the chamber. I think we both identified the perfect place for heckling ministers without the speaker necessarily knowing who it was. Three rows back, immediately behind the dispatch box on the opposition side. And of course, John was one of the most assiduous hecklers when he first became a member of Parliament. He became a little bit stuffy about it when he was in the Speaker's chair. I think that the first half of John's time as Speaker, he did more good than bad. He did give more time to backbenchers. He did make sure that ministers were brought to answer urgent questions more. Lots of positive things about accountability. But I think the second half of his speakership, which of course has coincided with the processes relating to Brexit, he clearly has become a player rather than a referee. And that is so utterly wrong. And I think it's a terrible shame because he would have had a good record to be proud of. Instead, I think he has damaged his own reputation and damaged the reputation of the office. And all of the candidates for Speaker last week in that election were talking about what they would do to try to rebuild that reputation.
So Graham Brady, thank you for coming to Chopper's Election Podcast. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Good to be here.
Now, my next guest is also a Tory candidate at this election, Kwasi Kwarteng. He's also an energy minister, and previously on this podcast, we knew him as a Brexit minister. And you're just telling me before we started there, Kwasi, that you can't even get into the House of Commons.
No.
Your pass has stopped working.
That's absolutely right. So I haven't stood down, just for the avoidance of...
Yeah, because others are saying that. But you're no longer the MP, now you're candidate.
So when the dissolution happens, there are technically no MPs, and we all have to go back to our constituencies and seek re-election. And at that time, you're quite right, we don't have access to the House of Commons or our offices.
I had no idea. So we're in the Red Lion pub as ever. We're literally 50 yards from the back gate to Derby Gate to get into the Commons, and you can't join. You're my friend. I'll get you as my guest.
Absolutely right. I think that we're not technically MPs, so we don't actually have access to the estate and to our offices. So everything that we need, we have to take out before.
And you can't go back and get anything. Extraordinary.
Happens, yeah.
How's the election going for the Tory party?
I think it's
day 3 now.
I think these elections are always challenging. They're also long as well. I mean, it's a 5-week campaign. I think we're heading out stride. I thought the launch yesterday was excellent. Boris made a very good speech.
We're talking Thursday morning, last night being Wednesday night. That's right.
That's right. I think Boris made a very good speech. I think there was a huge amount of energy and a real positive feeling in the room. And I think we're focused on trying to, deliver a good result.
I mean, it has been a difficult time. Alan Cairns has had to resign yesterday and delay Boris Johnson's speech on the steps of Number 10. Jacob Rees-Mogg had to apologise for saying that victims in Grenfell should use their common sense and ignore the fire service. Not easy, is it? But I mean, things can be wiped from the front page very quickly. Tom Watson is the news on Thursday morning, and Ian Austin quitting the party.
That's right. I mean, I think in elections, it's extraordinary how many stories will find their way to the front page and then they'll be superseded and removed by other stories. And we saw that yesterday. I think that Jacob apologised for his remarks. Alan, I think, was in a very difficult situation. But more interestingly, I think Tom Watson's departure was really picked up on. I think that was very significant. And I think Ian Austin on Thursday morning, this morning, was very heartfelt, very anguished. But it was an extraordinary thing for him to say that we should vote, or people should vote for the Tories, instead of letting Corbyn into power. And I thought that was a big moment. So I think the Austin intervention was something which was significant.
Although he no longer hasn't been a Labour MP since early this year because he quit over anti-Semitism. With Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you think he'll be put in a velvet lighten box for the election now? Will he be allowed out again?
I'm not sure. I mean, Jacob is a very effective communicator. I think his remarks were regrettable. He's apologised for them. And I think we'll move on. And it's up to the campaign managers to see, what role he has to play.
There were some things the Tories shouldn't talk about, possibly. One being trying to imagine you're in a burning building and you're not very well off and ignoring the fire service.
Look, I think there are Tories from lots of different backgrounds. I think Tories can talk about all sorts of different issues. I think the way he talked about that particular issue was not well advised. I think it was slightly insensitive, actually. But there should be no subjects which are taboo subjects for politicians. I think people should be able to speak freely and openly about subjects that they know about and feel passionately about.
You mentioned Tom Watson there, and it is striking about the clearing away of good politicians in their prime on both sides of the parties. I look at Amber Rudd, I look at Philip Hammond and others, Seema Kennedy, who I found out is standing down. She's a former PPS to Theresa May. I mean, there are people... When I started out covering politics 20 years ago, it was once you got in, you were there until you retired, and then you became a peer. I mean, you didn't leave halfway through in your prime. Are you surprised by it?
No, not really. I think it's the modern world. I mean, if I speak to people who've been at the end of their careers, and they've been in the same career 40 years, but people my generation in their early 40s and late 30s move around. The idea that you're in a career for 30 or 40 years across life is something which is being challenged now. People often have, mid-career breaks. They want to retrain in different professions. So I think just broadly, it's not that surprising. Specifically about the context today, it is a fevered environment. It is a highly pressurized environment. It's been a very polarized debate. And I think many people are saying in the House of Commons, maybe it's time to do something else. I don't think it's a cause for alarm.
Do you think that the two parties are being pushed out to the extremes by this? So I don't know if you accept the idea that Philip Hammond is not an extremist in terms of Brexit and that kind of thing.
Well, Philip has his own issues. I mean, Amber and Philip have their own issues. I don't quite know exactly what their reasoning was, and you'd probably have to ask them. I don't believe that we're being pushed to the extreme. If you look at Boris's offer, he talks about one nation conservatism. He talks about spending money on public services. He talks about recruiting more policemen. He talks about the NHS. I don't see this as an extreme agenda at all.
He's quite a left-wing Tory, isn't he? He always used to be anyway, in those words,
Yeah, I mean, he's
soft on immigration, soft on all sorts of areas.
He's very liberal. He won London twice. He didn't win London on an extreme right agenda.
It's just Brexit defines everything, doesn't it? That's the problem for all politics.
Well, Brexit is the key question of the age, and that's why, as Conservatives, we're saying let's get Brexit done, and then we can move on to talk about real things that affect people.
Well, about moving on and real things that affect people, will you be increasing the tax threshold to £80,000 of higher earners, as Boris Johnson promised in the summer?
I'm not sure that that's going to be in the manifesto, but we'll have to wait and see what's in it. I think that.
But why not? That was promised in the summer.
Well, I think I've always thought my main concern is to alleviate the burdens on people, who are earning less money perhaps than 80,000. And feel, that people complain in my constituency about, the cost of commuting, the cost of train fare. And these people aren't earning 80,000. I mean, they're earning a lot less than that. And I'm very concerned to alleviate the burden on them.
So we won't see that increase in the manifesto?
I don't know. I'm not responsible for the manifesto. I mean, it'll be a slightly more open process than 2017. But I'm not privy to that.
What's your advice to the writers of it?
I said
keep it simple.
Keep it simple, and we need to socialise it. I mean, my understanding of the last manifesto was that only 2 people had any sight of the whole thing before it was launched.
So lessons to learn this time, Kwasi Kwarteng.
Absolutely. I mean, we're certainly not going to take the electorate for granted. We should never, ever do that. We're going to fight, in every constituency for every vote we can. The result of this election is not a foregone conclusion by any means. I think the stakes are even higher now than they were in 2017. I think 2017 people thought that Corbyn had no chance. I think he does have a chance. I think there's a chance that we could have a coalition, a kind of technicolor coalition, as the Prime Minister described it, of utter chaos.
Is it time then that the Tories shook off the barnacles of the old days, like fox hunting, this kind of thing, and modernised the party and stop trying to...
I think we have modernised the party.
Legalise it,
people go on about all of this modernisation. I mean, I think we've been very successful in modernising the party. I mean, look at the front bench. When I got onto the list, there were no ethnic minority MPs. I got onto the list in 2004. Just before Adam Afriyie and Shailesh Vara got into the House in 2005. And they were the first ethnic minority.
The first in 05.
Yeah, in 05. And so the party's come a long way. And yes, there wasn't, I know one of you, or you've got a very attentive audience, and there was a unionist from India who was elected, I think, in 1892, before someone points that out. But in the modern age, these were the first ethnic minority MPs we had. And we've come a long way. I mean, you look at the senior officers of state. We've got Priti Patel, the Ugandan Asian as Home Secretary. We've got Sajid Javid as Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, it reflects
Britain more nowadays, the party.
Not only does it do that, the party is much more attuned, I think, to the concerns of many minority groups in the country than the Labour Party. I mean, there are dreadful problems with anti-Semitism. That was one of the things that Ian Austin mentioned in his very heartfelt plea not to vote for Corbyn, to vote for the Conservatives. And this is a man who's been a Labour MP for 15 years or more, I think. I think he just came in 2005. But the point is that, someone who's a Labour MP is now saying we should vote Conservative because Corbyn cannot deal with things like anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a big, big call.
Kwasi Kwarteng, candidate in Spelthorne and Bayes Minister, thank you for coming into Chopper's Election Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Now, stay with us. In just a moment, I'll be speaking to a man who makes it his mission to stay on top of the polls. And he has a great knowledge of UKIP, formerly, and now the Brexit Party. Writer and academic Matthew Goodwin. Right after this.
Hi, I'm Katie Morley and I'm the Telegraph's Consumer Champion. It's a big job title, but what it really means is that I help readers who are being ripped off. I've heard from scam victims, people whose insurance won't pay up, readers who've been on horrendous holidays or been fleeced by car hire firms. You name it, I've dealt with it. And I've managed to win back over £800,000 for our readers in less than 6 months. It's not always easy though. I've spent hours on the phone arguing with companies and stepped in where the police refused. And time, as we all know, means money. That's where our subscribers come in. If you subscribe to The Telegraph, you're helping fund public service journalism like this, as well as great podcasts like Choppers. So, if you'd like to support what we're doing and to get unlimited access to the huge range of world-class journalism, head to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. You can get 30 days free access to The Telegraph online, and after that it's just £2 a week. That's telegraph.co.uk/chopper, or click on the link in the show notes to this episode.
And joining me now in the Red Lion pub is Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and best-selling author on the issue of populism. And what Matthew doesn't know about that issue isn't worth knowing. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. You're an early supporter.
Good morning.
We're now a populist podcast, 3.2 million listens and downloads.
Brilliant.
For 132 episodes, all thanks to you and other people at the beginning.
I'm a big fan.
Now, you and I have charted the rise of UKIP over the past decade. I've been with you in goodness all days, Boston, all sorts of places, standing at the back of Farage rallies. He's standing again, his party is standing again at this election. He's not standing himself. Why? He's got Brexit. He's done it, right?
Well, he would argue what's on the table is not proper Brexit, and that's why the Brexit Party are going to be standing, I think, around 500-600 candidates. Now, of course, Nigel Farage really has to ask himself a question at this point, which is, does he want to go down in British history as the most influential politician not elected to Westminster who effectively brought about Brexit, or does he potentially want to go down in history as the guy that attracted 5 to 7% of the vote at the election and cost Boris Johnson and the Conservatives an election victory and by extension brought down Brexit? I mean, this is the fundamental choice, I think, that's facing both Farage and the Brexit Party. The reason I say that, Chris, is because things are so close. Now, if you look at the polls, you've got an average Conservative lead even today after the so-called disasters of Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments around Grenfell and Alan Cairns resigning, the Labour video that was mocked up on social media. Even today, the Conservatives are averaging 11-point leads in the polls. But as we know, the electorate's never been so volatile. Lots of people are still going to change their vote. We've still got a significant number of undecided voters that not many people are talking about. And that's why the last thing the Conservative Party needs and Brexit voters need is something that might derail their train unnecessarily.
Yeah, and that could well be him taking away sort of 7 or 8% of the vote, which may have gone towards the Tories.
Knowing a lot of the people around Farage, I imagine what's happened is they've probably done some constituency polling, looking at some of those potential seats for Farage. Thurrock, very marginal seat. Thurrock, very working class. They did say to me at one point, Chris, they wanted Farage to stand in a seat that was heavily working class, not because they just thought they could win it, but because they felt that context would actually protect Farage
standing
on
in a
the
seat
campaign
somewhere
trail.
in the middle of the UK. The problem I had when I was with him in 15, he was stuck in Kent. He couldn't escape Kent. It was a long way away from anywhere, and he couldn't escape because he was facing such heavy shelling from the Tory party. If he stood somewhere in the Midlands where he can get around as well as being his seat, he's got a chance.
Back to my point, right? If you look at some of those northern Labour seats like Hartlepool, Haywood and Middleton that have a strong tradition of voting for Farage, he could have a chance in some of those seats. Now, he's not standing. Why? I suspect they've done constituency polls which show that they are not sufficiently close. He doesn't want to go for an eighth time potential MP and lose again. So what he's arguing is, well, the Brexit Party can still tip the dial by standing in those northern pro-Brexit Labour seats. Of course, the problem is, in those more marginal seats, that Brexit Party candidate may just simply stop the Conservatives from crossing the line. Take Dudley North as an example. There's a majority of like 50 votes. That should automatically go into the Conservative column. Well, what happens if the Brexit Party candidate attracts even 5% of the vote?
How many seats will he stand in? You said there 500 to 600. He told me on Monday 630. He said on the Today programme on Thursday morning 600. How many seats will he stand in when we get there?
I think the numbers are going to be very large because they've been vetting candidates since the beginning of the year. They went through the European Parliament elections, basically screening candidates, picking them for selection. And Farage wants this to seem like it is a serious, wide vehicle. The more candidates they stand, the more they risk jeopardising Brexit and a Conservative majority. It is not true that the majority of Brexit Party voters are Labour leavers. That is a myth. Most Brexit Party voters are disillusioned Conservatives, and Boris Johnson is already squeezing that vote down. At the time of the European elections, Chris, over 40% of 2017 Conservatives were saying they're going to go to the Brexit Party. Now, that's down to 10%.
How does it look, him not standing for election this time, in your opinion?
I've known Nigel Farage for a long time. I think last week, he looked a little bit lost. I think he didn't know exactly what his role was going to be in this campaign. I think he's not entirely sure of where this movement is going.
The best chance he's got is to be like the DUP after the election. Boris Johnson has lost the DUP because of his deal. If there were, say, 10, 12...
I disagree
How
with
many
that. I would
MPs
disagree with
can
that.
he win,
I would
Matthew
disagree
Goodwin?
with that. I would disagree. I don't think the Brexit Party will win
Any
MPs.
Any.
I don't think
That's
they'll win
amazing.
any MPs. But I
You told me 6 in 2015, don't you?
No, I told you 4.
4.
I told
Was
you
it 4?
4, and they got 2 through the by-election. Anyway, but I don't think they'll win an MP. I think actually there's something else that Farage could do. I think he could go down in history as the most influential politician of the modern era. I think he could go down as the chief architect of our Brexit moment by simply instructing his supporters to vote for the Conservative Party and to vote for a pragmatic vision of Brexit. And then, spend the next few years campaigning, trying to influence the direction of the political declaration, the trade deal, and so on. At the moment, you just spend 2 minutes on social media, Chris. I've got a lot of Eurosceptics, for example, that follow me. And then the problem is he's damaging his own legacy at this point because a large number of them are really not happy with the current direction of travel.
Matthew Goodwin, we've barely even talked about Labour when I wanted to, and Lexit and the Red Wall. In 30 seconds, what is the challenge for all the main parties going after this working class Leave vote in the north of England?
Here's the challenge. Boris Johnson needs 8 more seats than Theresa May to win a majority. To do that, he's targeting Labour Leave seats. Theresa May in 2017 only won 6 pro-Brexit Labour seats. The problem for her is the Conservative vote went up by 11 points, but Labour's went up by 5 points too. Why did that matter? It mattered because these voters in Labour Leave seats want 2 things, Chris. They want you to tell them you're going to give them Brexit and you're going to reform migration, but they are also deeply anxious about an economic system that they feel is rigged. Johnson's going to have to go into the Dudley Norths, the Stoke Norths, and those seats, Darlington and others, and he's going to have to speak to these voters about Brexit, but also regional inequality, levelling the playing field, making life fairer for these voters
And
that
that
feel
is where the
capitalism
election
is
will be
not
fought,
working.
do you think?
It's
a Northern England election, do you think?
I think it's the Red Wall in the north combined with the Conservatives defending the Blue Wall in the southwest, holding off the Lib Dems and Labour in the southwest, holding those pro-Leave seats, the fishing seats and all the others, Devon, Cornwall and so on, and stealing some more of that Labour territory in the Midlands and the North, and the numbers are currently looking pretty good.
Matthew Goodwin, an amazing insight there into both the Brexit Party and Leave voters. Thank you for coming on Chopper's Brexit Podcast. And Matthew Goodwin is available in all good bookshops, I should say, and follow him on Twitter at GoodwinMJ. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, Labour's position on Brexit hasn't always been clear. Remain or leave, second referendum, dilly-dallying. And recently, a key ally of Jeremy Corbyn, Andrew Murray, the Chief of Staff at Unite the Union, caught my eye when he publicly advised Labour to stop taking sides in what he called the Brexit culture war if the party is going to win the upcoming election. So to dig a bit deeper, he's here in the Red Lion pub. Andrew, welcome to the podcast. Are you a familiar denizen of the Red Lion pub?
Well, not as much as I used to be.
Yes.
I used to be a lobby correspondent back in the 1970s and 80s for the Morning Star newspaper, and I was familiar with it then, but I'm not so frequently here now.
And you're a member of the Communist Party, weren't you, till 2016?
Yes, that's right. Since
You campaigned for
1976.
Brexit, I imagine?
I certainly voted Leave in the referendum. I didn't do any campaigning because I am, first of all, an official of Unite, and Unite, on balance, decided to support the Remain side, so I wouldn't get involved. But I mean, if people ask how I voted, I said I did vote Leave.
We've had the Communist Party of Britain, brackets Marxist-Leninists, on this podcast before about Brexit. And also I've seen them when I've done events with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage. They're outside giving out leaflets to Telegraph readers. And it just shows me how Brexit unites left and right.
Well, it does. I mean, I think within the 52% who voted Leave in 2016, there were more people of a sort of left-wing persuasion than might be generally acknowledged, because the campaign was definitely dominated by people on the right of politics, whether it's the Farageist nationalists or the sort of Daniel Hannan sort of Thatcherite position. But I mean, it's only an anecdotal. I've no statistics to back this up. But there is a tradition of left-wing criticism and opposition to the EU going back to Tony Benn, Michael Foot, indeed, in the 19th.
Marketeer criticism, that's right.
Yes. I mean, that basically it's a free market.
Because you can do so much with Brexit, can't you? If you want to intervene heavily in the markets, you can nationalise. You can do what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, which is nationalise areas, support other industries, and all sorts of things.
Well, I think the Telegraph's own Ambrose Evans-Pritchard does make the argument: why would people on the left in Britain, where we have a possibility, hopefully to be realised in the next month, of a transformational socialist government, want to tie themselves up with a body which clearly at some point is going to be obstructive to that project? I'm far from saying that a Labour government could not deliver its manifesto if it was in the EU, but at a certain point you do get into difficulties, and if you doubt it, you have to look at what the EU has done in recent times to Greece, for example.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, you and me talking, we're in the pub, no one's here. Is he a secret Brexiteer?
I absolutely believe he voted Remain in 2016. Yes, I mean his past record of criticisms is on the record of criticism of the EU, but I don't want to be held out as speaking for him on this. But a number of people took a view that maybe at a certain point Britain might be better off out of the EU, but to leave in 2016, when we had a Conservative government, would simply hand the initiative to the right wing. And that's a perfectly respectable argument, that actually now is not the time to be removing the protections that the EU does offer. Now, whether that is Jeremy's personal position, I don't want that to be misunderstood. But I'm absolutely certain that he voted Remain in 2016.
I was intrigued by the ideas in your new book called The Fall and Rise of the British Left. You talked about how the NHS is a communist shrine. Even for the Tory, and it probably is, I think if you think about what it offers, it is actually a communist shrine.
Well, I think it was Nigel Lawson that said the NHS is Britain's sort of nearest thing Britain has to a religion. And it was William Beveridge, one of the planners of the NHS during the Second World War, who said it should be developed on communist lines. Those are his phrases. I've sort of put them together. Yeah. But there is no doubt that much as some Conservatives may want to, tampering with the NHS as delivering free healthcare to the British people would be politically fatal. And it's one of the arguments in my book that I think the same considerations can be extended to the other necessities of life.
And eliminating the cost of travel to work, I thought was particularly attractive as a hard-pressed commuter like myself.
Yes, I mean, I don't think it could be done overnight by a Labour government, but reducing the cost of travel to work. Because, of course, as the housing crisis gets worse in London, people are forced to live further away and, further away from where their jobs are.
Key workers particularly.
Yes, and they are then getting really hit by travelling costs. I mean, I spent a lot of time in hospital recently after I had a heart attack, and I talked to some of the medical staff there, and I was struck by how they all were living on the edges of London or beyond. I was in Bart's Hospital. These were not living in Islington or Hackney now, where they might have done 30 years ago. They were living further out into Essex and Hertfordshire, and that means a lot of their money is being spent on
thousands of pounds
on train fares or tube fares, and I think this is a real issue, particularly in London and the South East, but not exclusively.
Will that be in a manifesto?
Well, I'm not writing the manifesto. I have to make that clear. But I'm sure that Labour will have a very attractive transport offer on that, the idea of taking the railways back into public control, I think has majority support amongst Conservative voters.
Well, I think so. That's one of the things that reaches out to Telegraph readers of all stripes, but also Tory supporters as well. I think that's an issue. I've got to ask you about you and the current news from Labour. Tom Watson has quit. That's bad news for the party, isn't it? I mean, or is it a relief?
Well, no. I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose the deputy leader on the eve of battle. I mean, I think I've always thought Tom is an interesting man who's not really. Doesn't really correspond exactly to his image as a sort of simply a Machiavellian fixer and a manoeuvrer. I mean, he wrote, I thought, a very dignified letter to Jeremy outlining the reasons why he's going. And, of course, this is a moment when lots of MPs are reflecting on their future. There's a very large number on both sides of the House deciding not to stand for re-election. And I think Tom's letter makes it clear it's not political. It's just he wants to do other things with his life. He does have other interests. He has a hinterland. And I think everyone will just wish him well. Ian Austin has been a very, I would almost say, intemperate critic of Labour for a number of years. He, I think, took a job with the government earlier on this year. So his announcement today is hardly
It was emotional, but not a surprise to you.
Hardly a surprise. And I think it is rather odd, I would say this, for him to be endorsing Boris Johnson when he says he's critical of Jeremy Corbyn, allegedly over issues of racism, and yet he is endorsing Boris Johnson, whose record on this matter, in terms of his own public statements, hardly stands up to any scrutiny at all.
Job with the Tory government?
Well, I think he's got one already. Didn't he? Was appointed some trade envoy to Israel after
It's not a paid role there, I think.
Is it not? No. Well, I don't want to say he's after a job. I've no idea. But I think he has been building up to this point in public for quite a long time.
May I ask you quickly before you go about yourself? In the papers this week, it's been claimed you're a security risk because of your close links to Russia.
Well, I mean, my political record is there. In the 1980s and beyond, I was a member of the Communist Party. I'm not ashamed of that. But it must occur to MI5 that the countries I was supposed to have a loyalty to, the Soviet Union, no longer exists and haven't for 30 years. So I'll be very surprised if on any intelligent view I was held to be a security risk, but I'm really not losing any sleep over the...
You're not a spy for the Russians, are you, Andrew Murray?
No.
Would you go into number 10 with Jeremy Corbyn?
I've not had that discussion at all. I'm employed by Unite. I'm the chief of staff there. That's a big enough job. I've no aspirations in that line. I've not had that discussion with Jeremy or anyone else. But
you would like to go in if asked. You'd serve, wouldn't you, at the pleasure of the Prime Minister, like everyone else would?
Well, I mean, let's cross that bridge when we get there.
Well, Andrew Murray, The Fall and Rise of the British Left is out now in all good bookshops by Verso. Thank you for coming to the Choppers Brexit Podcast, and do come on again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to my guests this week, Sir Graham Brady, Kwasi Kwarteng, Matthew Goodwin, and of course, Andrew Murray. Thank you to the podcast producers, Theo Ludis and Elliot Lampitt. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please do join AD12345 and Diz Daz Doz. They aren't bots, I'm sure, who've left us reviews on Apple Podcasts this week. It really helps other people find it. And subscribe to this feed to be the first to hear a special bonus episode of Chopper's Election Podcast with Dr. David Starkey, the TV historian. And if you want to get in touch, you can find us on Twitter at Brexit Broadcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. Don't forget, you can get 30 days free access to the entire Telegraph website completely free by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And finally, as I always say, always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. It's a bargain. Until next time, cheerio!
Hello there, Telegraph podcast listener. My name is Tom Gibbs and I'm the host of our Audio Football Club podcast. If your desire for top football chat isn't sated, then may I please recommend the Telegraph's very own podcast about that subject. Audio Football Club comes out every single Monday and it features some of the best and brightest football minds in the country, taking in all the biggest stories from the Premier League and around Europe. Search for Audio Football Club wherever you get your podcasts or follow the link in the description of this episode. Good things will happen to you if you do so.